Yes, radioactive particulates can travel thousands of miles from nuclear test sites carried by wind patterns and atmospheric currents. When a nuclear bomb detonates, it releases radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Depending on their size and weight, these particles can either fall to the ground nearby as fallout or remain suspended in the upper atmosphere, traveling vast distances before settling. For example, radioactive isotopes from nuclear tests conducted in the mid-20th century were detected in areas as far as the Arctic and Antarctic. The health effects of these particulates can be severe. When inhaled or ingested through contaminated air, water, or food, radioactive particles like cesium-137 or iodine-131 can accumulate in the body, damaging tissues and DNA. This increases the risk of cancers, particularly thyroid cancer and other illnesses such as leukemia. Historical cases, like the fallout from the Chernobyl disaster, demonstrated how radioactive clouds impacted countries thousands of miles away, causing widespread environmental and health consequences. Imagine radioactive particulates as microscopic hitchhikers catching a ride on global winds, silently spreading their harmful effects. Understanding their behavior and health impacts helps us prepare for and mitigate the risks of nuclear fallout, emphasizing the need for global monitoring and safety measures.
Radioactive particulates from nuclear bomb tests pose the greatest health risks immediately after detonation, primarily through exposure to short-lived isotopes like iodine-131. This isotope has a half-life of 8 days, and its primary health effects include thyroid damage and increased cancer risk. During the first few weeks, inhalation and ingestion of contaminated air, water, and food are the primary exposure routes. Short-lived isotopes are a major concern for populations downwind of the test site, where fallout settles quickly. Though these isotopes decay rapidly, their acute effects can lead to immediate health crises in exposed populations. During the 1954 Castle Bravo test, inhabitants of the Marshall Islands suffered acute radiation sickness due to immediate fallout exposure. Short-lived isotopes in fallout are like flash floods, devastating in the short term but dissipating quickly. Long-lived isotopes like cesium-137, half-life 30 years, and strontium-90, half-life 28 years, remain hazardous for decades. These isotopes persist in the environment, accumulating in soil, water, and biological systems. Strontium-90 mimics calcium and is deposited in bones and teeth, while cesium-137 can contaminate entire food chains, posing risks of internal radiation exposure. Even decades after a nuclear test, populations near contaminated sites or consuming affected food sources can face increased risks of cancers, particularly bone, thyroid, and blood cancers. Elevated levels of strontium-90 in children's teeth were detected worldwide following the peak of atmospheric nuclear testing in the 1960s. Long-lived isotopes are like slow-releasing toxins, affecting health gradually over many years. High-altitude nuclear tests release radioactive particulates into the stratosphere, where they can remain suspended for months or years. These particles are carried by atmospheric currents, enabling global dispersion. Fallout from nuclear tests in one region can be detected thousands of miles away, as seen with the dispersal of isotopes from Soviet tests in Siberia to North America or Nevada tests to Europe. The extent of dispersion depends on particle size, wind patterns, and atmospheric conditions. Larger particles settle quickly near the test site, while smaller particles travel farther, contaminating vast areas. Example: radioactive isotopes from Chernobyl's reactor explosion were detected across Europe within days. Analogy: radioactive particulates in the atmosphere are like dust carried by the wind, settling wherever conditions allow. Radioactive fallout from tests conducted 50 to 100 years ago can still pose health and environmental risks due to the persistence of isotopes like cesium-137 and plutonium-239. These isotopes have half-lives of 30 years and 24,100 years, respectively, meaning they decay slowly and remain hazardous in soil, water, and sediments. Sites like Bikini Atoll and Semipalatinsk still show elevated radiation levels, making them uninhabitable for humans and unsuitable for agriculture. Efforts to clean up these sites are ongoing, but face significant technical and financial challenges. Example: decades after nuclear tests, plutonium isotopes are still detectable in the soil of the Nevada test site, posing risks to local wildlife and humans. Analogy: residual contamination is like a scar on the environment, fading slowly but never fully disappearing. Even at low doses, long-term exposure to radioactive fallout can increase the risk of cancer and other health problems. Chronic exposure to low-level radiation from contaminated environments or food sources can damage DNA, leading to genetic mutations and an elevated likelihood of diseases over time. Populations living near former test sites or in areas where fallout accumulated often experience higher rates of thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other radiation-associated illnesses. Studies in Kazakhstan show increased cancer rates among residents near the Semipalatinsk test site, even decades after testing ceased. Low-dose radiation is like a slow-burning ember, causing damage quietly over a prolonged period. Radioactive particulates can re-enter the environment through natural processes like erosion, flooding, and wildfires, prolonging their influence. Once deposited in soil, isotopes can be resuspended into the air or leach into water supplies, extending their health impacts over time. In agricultural areas, radioactive materials can be taken up by plants, entering the food chain and reaching human populations. This environmental cycling ensures that fallout remains a health concern long after the initial contamination. Wildfires in Chernobyl's exclusion zone released cesium-137 back into the atmosphere decades after the disaster. Radioactive isotopes in the environment are like ghosts, reappearing periodically to remind us of their presence. Monitoring and remediation are essential for minimizing the health impacts of radioactive fallout. Advanced technologies like Geiger counters, satellite imaging, and mass spectrometry are used to detect and measure residual radiation. Cleanup efforts often involve removing contaminated soil, treating water supplies, and restricting access to highly irradiated areas. While these efforts can reduce exposure risks, they are costly and time-consuming, with some isotopes requiring containment rather than removal. At the Bikini Atoll, soil remediation involved removing the top layer of irradiated soil, but radiation levels remain too high for permanent human habitation. Monitoring and cleanup are like scrubbing a stain that never fully goes away. It reduces the impact but can't entirely erase the problem. The cumulative effects of nuclear tests conducted in the 20th century are still detectable worldwide. Fallout isotopes like strontium-90 and cesium-137 persist in soil, water, and even human tissues. These global residues provide a record of atmospheric nuclear testing and continue to influence public health and environmental policies. While modern radiation levels from historical tests are low, their existence serves as a reminder of the long-term consequences of nuclear activities. Traces of cesium-137 from Cold War-era tests are still detectable in glaciers, oceans, and sediments across the globe. The global impact of historical tests is like an echo that fades over time but never completely disappears. Exposure to radioactive fallout can cause genetic mutations, some of which may be passed to future generations. These mutations can increase susceptibility to certain diseases or result in developmental abnormalities. Research into transgenerational effects of radiation exposure is ongoing, with findings suggesting potential impacts on fertility, lifespan, and genetic health in descendants of exposed populations. Studies of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki have revealed an increased frequency of genetic mutations in their offspring. Radiation exposure is like a ripple in a pond, with effects spreading to future generations long after the initial impact. Radioactive particulates from nuclear bomb tests can influence health and the environment for decades or even centuries. While short-lived isotopes pose immediate risks, long-lived and extremely long-lived isotopes create persistent hazards that span generations and distances. Understanding and mitigating these impacts through monitoring, cleanup, and policy enforcement remain critical to protecting public health and ensuring environmental safety.